Paul sat in his study, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the stacks of old case files that filled the room. Retirement hadn't been kind to him. The silence that once felt like a respite now gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the cases he couldn't solve, the victims he couldn't save. He picked up his cup of coffee, lukewarm by now, and took a slow sip, letting his gaze drift over the cluttered desk. It was then that he noticed it, a plain white envelope lying innocently among the clutter. He didn't remember seeing it before, and there was no return address. Frowning, Paul tore it open, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat, almost meticulous. "Dear Detective Paul, I'm writing to confess. You remember the Coldwater Park murders, don't you? The woman in the red dress found near the lake, the young man by the fountain. Cases you couldn't close. I killed them. I know you've never forgotten them, and neither have I. But here's the twist, Paul. I didn't kill them out of hate. It was justice. My kind of justice. Yours sincerely, The Shadow." Paul's hand shook as he read the letter. It couldn't be real. No one knew the details of those cases except him and a handful of officers, all of whom had either retired or moved on. But there's more. P.S. How's the coffee? Still drink it black with 2 sugars? I bet. Just like always. Paul dropped the letter as if it had burned him. He hadn't spoken to anyone about his coffee habit in years. His heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. Whoever had written this knew him well, too well. It wasn't just a letter from a killer, it was personal. He picked up his phone, his first instinct to call the police, but he stopped himself. No, he needed more proof. He couldn't go running to his old colleagues with a single letter and a claim that might just be an elaborate prank. Paul grabbed the file from the stack on his desk, the Coldwater Park murders, unsolved for nearly a decade. He opened it, spreading the crime scene photos and notes across his desk. The details in the letter matched perfectly, details that had never been made public. He read the letter again, his mind spinning. Who could know this? And why reach out now, after all this time? He turned back to the envelope, searching for clues. It was blank, no markings, no stamp. Whoever had sent this had delivered it by hand. The realization made his blood run cold. This wasn't just a confession, it was a message. The killer was close, closer than he had ever imagined. Paul stared at the letter, feeling the weight of his past pressing down on him. He hadn't realized it yet, but he had just opened the door to darkness he thought he had left behind, and it was only just the beginning. Paul's mind raced as he drove through the city streets, the letter tucked inside his jacket pocket. He knew he should have handed it over to the police, but this was personal now. Whoever the sender was, they knew too much about him and his cases. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was a game, and he was being pulled into it. He arrived at the Coldwater Park precinct, where he had worked for the most of his career. The station was quieter now, with fewer familiar faces. He walked in, nodding to the desk sergeant, who gave him a curious look. "Paul? Haven't seen you around here in a while. Everything okay?" "Yeah, just following up on an old lead," Paul lied, forcing a smile. He made his way to the archive room, the scent of old paper and dust greeting him like an old friend. He pulled out the files on the Coldwater Park murders, spreading them out on a table. The photos of the victims stared back at him, frozen in time. The first victim was a woman in her 30s, found in a red dress lying face down near the lake. The second was a young man, barely 20, discovered by the fountain. Both cases had been investigated thoroughly, but the leads had dried up, leaving nothing but cold trails. Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter again, comparing its contents with the notes in the files. Every detail was correct, down to the specific cuts on the victims. This wasn't a prank. This was a confession form, someone who had been there, who had seen the blood spill. He clenched his fist, anger rising in his chest. He spent years chasing the killer, nights haunted by the faces of the victims, and now this stranger was taunting him. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He needed a plan. The letter had mentioned something specific about the coffee, 2 sugars, just like he liked it. It was a detail only someone who had been close to him would know. Paul's mind flashed back to his old cases, the colleagues he had worked with, the witnesses he had interviewed. Could the sender be someone he had crossed paths with? Someone who had watched him all this time? Just as he was about to leave, his phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. "You're getting warmer, Paul. Check the lake. I left something there for you." His blood ran cold. They were watching him. He stuffed the files back into the cabinet and rushed out the precinct, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drove to the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap, but he had no choice. He had to know who was behind this. The shadows of his past had come back to haunt him, and he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The wind howled as Paul parked his car near the edge of Coldwater Lake. The sky was overcast, casting a gray pallor over the water. He stepped out, the chill seeping into his bones. This place held too many memories, most of them bad. Paul made his way down the dirt path to the water's edge, his eyes scanning the area. It was quiet, too quiet, as if the world was holding its breath. He spotted something glinting in the reeds near the shore, a small silver object. He bent down, fishing it out the muddy water. It was a locket covered in grime but still intact. He pried it open and felt his heart stop. Inside was a photograph of a young woman, her smile frozen in time. He recognized her immediately. It was his ex-wife, Rachel. He staggered back, the locket slipping from his fingers. This wasn't just a taunt anymore. It was personal. Whoever was behind this knew everything about him, even details of his private life he tried to bury. Suddenly, the voice came again, but this time, it wasn't in his head. It was behind him. "You remember her, don't you, Paul?" a familiar voice said. It was his own voice, echoing across the lake. He spun around, but there was no one there. His pulse raced, the fear gripping him like a vice. He stumbled back, staring at his reflection in the water, but the face staring back wasn't his own. It was twisted, contorted with a manic smile, and it spoke to him with a cold, mocking tone. "You're getting closer, Paul," the reflection said. "It's time you remember what you've been trying so hard to forget." Paul's knees buckled as he fell to the ground, clutching his head. Fragments of memories flashed before his eyes, moments of rage, of blackouts he had dismissed as stress. The face in the water grinned wider. "I'm you, Paul," the voice whispered. "I'm the part of you that you locked away, the part that decided to do what you couldn't." The truth hit him like a freight train. It wasn't a stranger tormenting him. It was his own mind, fractured by years of staring into the abyss, of absorbing the darkness he had fought so hard to pull away. He was the killer. Paul stumbled back from the water's edge, his breath coming in ragged gas. The reflection in the lake was gone, replaced by his own pale, haunted face. But the voice was still there, echoing inside his head like the remnants of a nightmare he couldn't wake from. "You can't escape me, Paul," he whispered, a sinister edge to the familiar tone. "A part of you. I've always been here." Paul sank to his knees, clutching his head. He fought to piece together the fractured memories, the moments of blackouts and unexplained absences. He had dismissed them as the stress of a long career, the toll of looking into the abyss for too many years. But now the truth clawed its way to the surface. He remembered the Coldwater Park murders, the rage he had felt seeing those innocent faces, the frustration at the lack of justice. He had buried those emotions deep, trying to maintain the facade of a dedicated detective. But in doing so, he had created something far darker, a separate persona that took matters into its own hands. "I'm not the killer," Paul whispered, shaking his head as if he could spell the truth. "It was you." A cold, mocking laugh filled his ears. "I am you," the voice responded. "You created me because you couldn't do what needed to be done. You're the one who wanted justice, Paul. I was just a tool you used to get it." Tears blurred his vision as he pulled himself to his feet, staggering back to his car. He couldn't process it, couldn't accept that he had become the monster he had spent his life hunting. He had dedicated his career to protecting people, to upholding the law, and now it was the very thing he had sworn to destroy. He fumbled for his phone, dialing the number of his old partner, Detective Harris. It rang once, twice, and then Harris's gruff voice answered. "Paul, is everything okay?" Paul's mouth went dry. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words couldn't come. How could he explain this? How could he confess to something he couldn't even fully understand himself? "I need to see you," Paul managed, his voice shaking. "It's urgent." Harris hesitated. "Paul, you sound off. Are you okay?" "Just meet me at the station," Paul said, his grip on the phone tightening. "I'll explain everything." He hung up before Harris could respond. He knew what he had to do. Turn himself in, confess to the murders. It was the only way to make it right. But as he drove back toward the city, the voice in his head grew louder. "You won't do it," it taunted. "You're too afraid. You'd rather live with a lie than face the truth." Paul gritted his teeth, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He couldn't let this part of him win. He had to take control, once and for all. But deep down, he knew the hardest battle was yet to come. Paul walked into the precinct, the familiar scent of stale coffee and old paperwork washing over him like a wave of nostalgia. It was quieter now, the night shift officer barely glancing up as he passed by. He spotted Detective Harris waiting by the interrogation room, his expression a mix of concern and confusion. "Paul, what's going on?" Harris asked, stepping forward. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Paul forced a hollow smile. "Maybe I have," he muttered, pushing open the door to the empty room. He needed a quiet space away from prying eyes. "We need to talk alone." Harris followed him inside, closing the door behind him. "Alright," he said, leaning against the table. "I'm listening." Paul took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "The letters," he began, his voice hoarse. "The ones I've been receiving. From the Coldwater Park killer." Harris's eyes widened. "What? How do you know that? Did you find a suspect?" Paul's hands trembled as he sat the letters down on the table. "Yes," he whispered. "It's me. I'm the killer." For a moment there was only silence. Harris stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief. "Paul," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "It's not funny. What are you talking about?" "I'm not joking," Paul snapped, his voice crackling. "I didn't know it, Harris. I swear, I didn't. But it's the truth. I have another personality. It took over when I couldn't handle the rage anymore. I killed those people." Harris took a step back, his face pale. "This is insane," he whispered. "You're saying you've been hunting yourself this whole time?" Paul nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't want to believe it either, but I remember now. I can see it all. The nights I blacked out, the times I couldn't account for. It was me." Harris clenched his fist, the muscles in his jaw working as he processed what Paul was saying. "Why are you telling me this? Why now?" "Because I can't live with it," Paul said, his voice breaking. "I need you to arrest me. I need to face the consequences." The voice in his head laughed, a cold, mocking sound that sent shivers down his spine. "You really think you can do this?" he taunted. "You're a coward. You'll never be able to confess." Paul squeezed his eyes shut, fighting against the voice. "I have to," he whispered. "I have to make it right." He held out his wrist, trembling. "Do it, Harris, please." Harris hesitated, his eyes filled with pain. "Paul," he said softly, "are you sure about this?" "Yes," Paul said, his voice steady for the first time. "I'm sure." Harris pulled out the handcuffs, snapping them around Paul's wrist. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't be," Paul replied. "It's finally over." As Harris led him away, the precinct fell silent. Paul felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He had faced the darkest part of himself, and though the road ahead would be hard, he knew he made the right choice. The voices were gone now, leaving only silence.